Looks like you didn't empty the wastebasket again.
No, it's emptied. There's nothing in it.
Moving really slow.
Well, it must be something else, due to something else. All right. For the last couple of meetings, we have been discussing retrospection. And that's a little bit off of this sub-series, which is supposed to be about the cosmological cycle of rebirth. And we have deviated intentionally because retrospection is so very important for spiritual attainment. It's probably the most important and the most potent exercise for soul growth. In retrospection, there is a bonus as far as spiritual exercises are concerned, in that it is safe. And most of the spiritual exercises that are potent are not always safe, a little bit dangerous. Now, toward the end of the talk previous to this talk, we were discussing a principle or a process that we called rethinking, because it is a neologism. And so we coined that word since there really is no term for it. And I've never even seen not even any statement about it. In the rethinking, the spirit, the self, or the spiritual ego, peers through the lens of mind and into the concrete worlds. And the concrete worlds is where we are manifesting our existence right now, where we're getting our experience. And in rethinking, the spirit renews or reviews the events of life, because events, whether they're big events or little events, are finalizations. Things work from within out, and when they get as far out as they're going to get, that becomes an event. And that event is what determines whether the creative impulse was successful or not. And the spirit, in rethinking, is reviewing things from consequence back to cause, or from reaction back to action. In doing this, psychic energy and the essence of the events is discharged. They're neutralized, and they are released. And in rethinking, the spirit takes them into itself. And it is sort of like trying to see a putt into the hole or to see a pool ball into the pocket. It rethinks the essence of the experience into itself, knowing now that this is complete or as final as it can be, and this is my, this is the answer to what I have done. So it is a seeing of the meaning of the experience into the spirit. Now, since this is done through the lens of the concrete mind, it is a process of thinking, which is why we're calling it rethinking, for the want of a better word. Now, rethinking is a central part of retrospection, and it is a central part of the review right after death when the life has just finished. In both cases, there is a review of the living images that are in the vital body. However, there are differences between retrospection and the review at death. In retrospection, the review is voluntary. And it's voluntary in such a way that it is like swimming upstream, because life is still going on. There's still, the archetype for the life is still spinning forward, and life wants to go forward. But after death, the review is involuntary. The will to live, the creative impulse that brought the spirit back to rebirth, has gone as far as it can go. And it lets go because it can't do anymore. And when it lets go, things unwind, just sort of like an old wind-up clock. Then as the etheric vital body is disintegrating after death, the pictures that are in its formation are released, and one sees them. Now, it is these images that the spirit watches, and it watches with great fascination. In fact, I don't know how it's possible to not view etheric images like that without fascination. Even in retrospect, you look and things are so exact that it's astounding. Now, there still is a resonance between the etheric body and the dense physical body. So there are things that can distract the spirit from actually viewing the images. So things like embalming or organ harvesting or post-mortem examinations like autopsies are exceedingly distracting, and they're to be avoided if it is at all possible. Sometimes you can't avoid an autopsy, it's just too hard. Sometimes activities in the environment, both the physical and the psychic environment, can also be distracting, so that excess mourning or a really crazy, noisy environment like a battlefield can distract one from fascination. Now, our life here is very precious, because it is only here that we can awaken self-consciousness through our experiences. Our entire evolutionary future depends on what we do here. And the soul material that we will have to be able to move forward also depends on what we draw from our life here. So it's extremely important that if it is in any way possible, not to disrupt the process. Now, this is another reason why retrospection is so important. Because if we harvest the soul material day by day, then in the panorama immediately after death, most of it has been taken care of already. And it isn't so critical. Those 72 hours aren't so critical because you've already taken out the essence of experience that needs to be taken out. Some people can come back to birth almost immediately because they have worked on retrospection in their life. Max Heindel speaks of a case where somebody who had been a retrospector for most of his life and retrospected the earlier things before he became involved with mysticism, he says that after death he went looking for this person, he couldn't find him, and he was already in third heaven, which means that he had no purgatory, no first heaven, no second heaven. That was all taken care of by the retrospection. Now, there are other differences between retrospection and the past life panorama. And the differences are mostly differences of degree. Things of the spirit in time are more intensive, while things of matter in space are more extensive. And intensive scales are scales of degree. So it's not surprising that spiritual processes like retrospection or the past life panorama would be a matter of degree. So the disintegrating effect of rethinking is different after death than it is in retrospection. After death, the disintegrating effect is much more thorough. If there has been a thorough review of the images in the ethers because the spirit gave itself with full attention to the activity, the more formed part of the etheric body basically becomes amorphous. This is why if you go to a graveyard of somebody who died maybe a week ago and look above the grave, you see an amorphous, I don't know, say fog of light is the way you'd have to say it, because it no longer has that form. It's been disintegrated by the panorama. Now, there are some exceptions, because there are some beings that resist the cosmological process after death. In fact, there are entire subcultures that are obsessed with remaining in physical existence and try to avoid the life cycle because they want to be here and they want to be here all the time. And they institute cultural practices that allow them to sustain a modest etheric existence here in the lower realms. Like, for example, in some cultures, like early Native American cultures, and there are places, other places in the world, personal items that are charged with etheric flux from being used regularly are buried with the person or put in a place where the person can suck up that energy and stay here at least a little bit longer. But that's a very modest amount of energy that you can get that way. So, earthbound spirits, is what they're usually called, are in search of more rich etheric sources. And one of the richest sources is freshly let blood. Of course, there has to be quite a bit of blood, and it has to flow, and it has to be copious, and it has to be newly let, because the ethers are off of the blood in a very short amount of time. A very good example of this is given in the Aeneid by Virgil. Aeneas has escaped from Troy in the Trojan War, and he's on this long journey. He doesn't know it, but he's supposedly founding Rome. And amazingly, that story is actually true, according to people who follow past lives, that the Trojans became the Romans and the Greeks became the Carthaginians, and they've been fighting ever since. And the Germans were the Greeks, and the Brits were the Romans. Apparently they learned something there, that they're more... But they keep fighting each other back and forth, rebirth after rebirth. But Aeneas is seeking advice from somebody he can trust. And he wants it from his father Anchises. And so what he does is they have a ceremony in which there is a lot of animal sacrifice. And their blood runs into this trough. And as soon as there's blood in the trough, ghosts appear from everywhere because they want to suck it up. There are ones that are stuck here or want to stay here all the time. And they have to be warded off by someone, which is what happens in the Aeneid, somebody who is strong enough mentally to keep them away. I have a friend who has first-hand experience with this. he befriended an African witch doctor. And during one visit to Africa, visiting that witch doctor, somebody from the United States came, and he was seeking a promotion to a position of power in his work. And he agreed to pay for the sacrifice of a bull to obtain, to obtain his object. And my friend said that when that bull was sacrificed and the blood flowed onto the totem, my friend said, I'm not clairvoyant, but I could see, it was almost like zinging of lights coming in to draw the energy off the blood on the totem, like birds sweeping in. And my friend said, that poor man who made that sacrifice, he had no idea what he was getting into, because blood sacrifices are extremely binding. And in this case, it probably bound him to a very degrading path. All right, enough for stories for a while. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no disintegration or extraction in retrospection. As said earlier, psychic energy, both etheric and emotional, is discharged. And you are no longer psychologically burdened by your past. Though I myself am not a highly skilled retrospector, I can say some things from experience. I have many, many fewer neurotic hang-ups than when I was young. I also have much more peace than I ever had, and I have much more positivity about exploring new emotions and trying new inner things. So from experience, it seems that emotional effects are removed and the meaning is removed, but the memory is not disintegrated as it is in the postmortem. It's so much so that I have an improved memory in myself since working more and more on retrospection. I still do have some of the geriatric memory loss, which I am guessing is due to losing neurons in the brain, in the chemical body. But in general, my memory is much, much better. And the etheric memory, rather than when you just try to remember something through your brain, is much more accessible. And when it's accessible, you have examples. And it's accessible to the higher nature, to the spiritual self. Because if you're going to do something that is a repetition of something wrong that you have done before, the higher spirit can throw it up before your inner eye, so that, you know, it's like a conscience. Again, I'd like to deviate from a linear presentation of this cosmological cycle. And the reason I want to deviate is because my life might not extend far enough into the future for me to return to the principle of rethinking. So it's going to be a little tiny exegesis into only one fact about rethinking. And it has to do with the principle of analogy, as above, so below. In the same way that the application of the principle of rethinking in retrospection is analogous to rethinking in the postmortem, all of the postmortem states until we start coming back to rebirth. this principle is also used in a much greater sense in cosmogony. That is, in the birth and death of the entire solar system, which is much more than the physical solar system we see. That principle is active in that. According to the spiritual adepts, this is how it occurs when world by world is disintegrated and the spirit takes everything back into itself. It is done by this same principle of rethinking. So the essential essence of all of the worlds as fields of experience is rethought. The concrete worlds, the physical, both chemical and etheric, are taken into the desire world and then through that into the mind and back into the spirit. This is done in a kind of a reverse order, in that the more gross worlds disintegrate first and then the rarer and rarer worlds. It's kind of awesome to recognize how deep your rethinking can be. And then people talk about forgiveness and things like that. Wow, that's a rethinking that is really a dissolving thing. Now we want to look at the positive building effects of rethinking, and we're not even going to get done with that tonight. It's going to take us at least the next meeting before we get done with that. It appears to be identical in some respects in both retrospection and in the postmortem. In modern Christian mysticism, there are general and specific terms for the essence of experience that is drawn out of concrete existence. And the general term is soul. S-O-U-L. Thus, the consequence of experience is soul. And one who has grown or awakened through experience and has harvested the essence of that experience is said to be soulful. Now, in our language, words like soulful has connotations that don't apply to what we're talking about. So this dilemma has to be satisfied. We have to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And it is only general, a person is only soulful according to how well they can live from past experiences. You say that you come to an experience where somebody might be extremely emotionally excitable, but they aren't. And that's because that person has learned about emotional excitability and they're soulful as a result of it. Now, this kind of thinking is not radical. It's the same kind of thinking that is if you look in want ads when it says experience necessary. Because no matter how much training you can give a person, it isn't a matter of, there are some things that you can't get without having had the experience of them. Now, about this point in making these notes, a sense of panic began to rise in me because I realized the depth and the difficulty of the subject that I have worked myself into is more than I might be capable of. So we're going to try and look at something that is very profound and something that is very fundamental. I'm not sure that I'm capable of bringing it off at all, let alone try to do it well. So please be patient and verify what is said and give me correction along the way. I should also mention that at the same time I had a feeling of panic, I also had a feeling of excitement. And for me, it's a great excitement. It's sort of like what an amusement park is to a teenager, being able to condense things that have been in my inner understanding into words and being able to share them is one of the most exciting things in life. So even though I may not be able to talk about all these things very well, I'm going under the assumption of what I've learned in the past. I've learned that if you express as much as you can of what you know now, that opens you up to know more. And so I'm going to do that. First, we have to have a micro-mini review to orient ourselves. We're studying cosmology from the viewpoint of modern Christian mysticism. We're currently studying the cycle of rebirth. And in that cycle, we're looking at the review of the life panorama from the living records in the etheric vital body right after death. And we're comparing it to the spiritual exercise called retrospection, wherein one does the same work day by day for faster and much more efficient soul growth. We have just finished the disintegrating effect of the principle of we are calling rethinking, and we are now going into the positive or building effects of it. We're discussing now the extraction, not the disintegration, of the essence of events in the worlds in which we live. And we said that essence is called soul. The building of that soul into the spirit and its vehicles is called soul growth. Very simple. Now, it must be obvious that there are different kinds of soul. It must be because we pass through and experience different kinds of worlds, which are quite different from each other. Physical experiences are much, much different than emotional experiences, even if we're having them simultaneously. The feelings about a physical event are altogether different than the physical event itself. And that's exactly what trained mystical clairvoyants find. They find that we extract soul stuff from every world or major subdivision of a world that we pass through. Now, one can say that we extract soul material from every realm, that we have a vehicle of consciousness for her. And there is one exception, and that exception is the concrete mind, because the concrete mind is the focal agency for the development and the accomplishment of soul growth through which the spirit, the spirit sees through it. Now, first we have to address a parallel and shared activity to soul growth. It is the relationship of vehicular development to soul growth. We have three vehicles of consciousness involved with soul growth. We have the dense physical body, which currently relates us to the chemicals, the denser subdivision of the physical world. We have an etheric vital body, which relates us to the etheric subdivision of the physical world. And we have a desire body, which some call an astral body, which relates us to the desire world. Now, these vehicles that we have are living resultants from the sum total of our accomplishment in the principles they represent. They're sort of like histories of vehicles, cosmic histories. I'll try to say that again. The vehicles of consciousness are living resultants from the sum total of our accomplishment in the principles from which each vehicle represents. Now, that's a very awkward way of saying this, and that is intentionally awkward. Now, there's a temptation to say that the dense physical body and its efficiency and its perfection is consequence of everything that we have experienced and learned from experience in the chemical subdivision of the physical world. That would be true, but it's only partly true. According to the adepts who can look very far back into cosmic history, there was a time when the vehicle we now call the dense physical body existed, but there was no physical world. So what we're talking about is an evolution of an abstract spiritual principle. And the principle of the dense physical body is a principle of form or shape or substance or something like that. And that idea was there long before there was a physical world. At first, that principle was expressed as a concrete thought. Because everything in concrete manifestation begins with a concrete thought. Everything is projected that way. Without going into all kinds of detail, in fact, going into no detail, that principle went through all kinds, a multitude, you might say, of conditions in a sequence of worlds before it reached its full maturity. And the full maturity of that principle of form or shape or substance is now in the chemical subdivision of the physical world. Now, concurrent with this evolution of form in various kinds of stuff, in spirit, a self, a spiritual being, an individuality, a spiritual ego was being developed. Now, this was a concurrency, but there was a kind of reflective causal dependence. The spirit was being developed according to what was learned in the physical part through a material evolution. So this is another way of saying that the spirit came into being concurrently and dependently with the development of the personality. But the personality led because we learn by experience, and that awakens a potential in spirit. Now, please please, please remember that this is a very sketchy statement. The point is that our bodies are a condensation, a history of all we have experienced about form and stuff and shape. Now there are various local variations. For example, if a person is deformed physically in one life, that doesn't mean that for all those that's just a local variation as the individuality is going through a local series of causes and consequence. Now, the same is true of our etheric vital bodies and our desire bodies. Each of them is a manifestation of a principle. Each vehicle that we have is a condensed history over evolutionary time. Each vehicle entered the cosmogony, or the great spiritual evolution, at a different stage in that process. As we said, the dense physical body is now mature. It's as ripe as the body of shape or form or stuff is it's ever going to be. It's the oldest. The principle of vitality or energy or movability is the next oldest, and the desire nature or the motivational nature or the emotional nature is the youngest. Now, the concrete mind is also a vehicle, but it's special and it's different. It is the link through which the spirit now enters its vehicles and directs the evolutionary process from within. Big, big difference. Things come and go to the spirit through the concrete mind. And that includes the absorption of soul material. Finally, this brings us to the question that we want to ponder, because it pertains to our soul growth. And we're not even going to answer this question yet tonight. It'll be the beginning of the next time that we answer it. When I was a kid, I lived on a farm, and a quarter of a mile away was a crossroads bar and dance hall and grocery store, just plopped down in the middle of the farm country. And when I was a kid, in summertime, they used to hang a sheet out, and they would have movies. And you'd come to the movies every week. I suppose they rented them just like a movie theater. And at one time, the movie was about the Durango Kid. And the Durango Kid was a good guy. But the Durango Kid, the bad guys had gotten him and threw him down in a well. And that was the end of that installation. And I never got to see whether the Durango Kid got out of there. So I have this, I have this kind of consciousness that, episodical. It holds together and never, never ends. The question that we're asking, this is a very difficult question. If our bodies are a condensation of what we have learned from a multitude of experiences, how are they different from the accumulations of soul growth, which are also a accumulation from experiences? I'll state it again because it's an interesting proposition. If our bodies are a concentration of what we have learned from a multitude of experiences, how are they different from the accumulations of soul growth? Now, to answer this question, I'm going to have to rely on the reports of people whose spiritual capacities well exceed my own. That's always risky, but if we apply observation and our own intuition and reason, we should come out all right. A partial answer to the question is that to some extent there is no difference between soul accumulation or soul growth and residual evolutionary development in our vehicles. Soul material, in part, becomes an integral ingredient of all future vehicular compositions. Max Heindel has gone so far as to say that things like the soul body, part of the etheric body, is composed of the two higher ethers, which he calls immortal. That raises all kinds of questions, and in my misunderstanding, even doubts, because they say about people when they die, you never see a U-Haul following behind the hearse because you can't take it with you. And if those ethers are immortal, you can't take them into the transcendental world. You can't take the ethers here and put them into the, and still have them be ethers. You know what I mean? You can take the essence of them and build that into the spirit, but you can't take them in. So I'm not sure that I understand that. I'm not sure that I agree with that. But there is little doubt to any clairvoyant that there is part of the soul material remains in the vehicles. Even without clairvoyance, you can look at soulful people and you can see they walk in their own light. It's like they have the light around them. The Renaissance painters, they weren't fooling you. They were painting what they were seeing. So we can see, as we saw earlier, this is a matter of degree. The degree of how spiritualized the essence of the experiences is. Now, I'm going to bring up an idea that it's so off the wall, I don't know where it goes. And I'm going to ask Tim if he knows, because he had read a lot more on some of these subjects than I have. I'm just here because I'm the talkative one, not because I know more. In the Rosicrucian CosmoConception, it states that the emotional soul, which is a product of spiritualizing the essence of experiences in the desire world, is found in the three highest regions of the desire body. And those regions are named by soul. They're called the regions of soul light, soul life, and soul power. Now, similarly, it states that the intellectual soul, which is gleaned from experiences in the ethers, in the etheric subdivision of the physical world, is found in the two highest ethers, the light ether and the reflecting ether. That word intellectual is an atavism from earlier mystery schools. The connotation of the word intellectual is not what we have in everyday usage at this time. The etheric subdivision of the physical world is the reflective projection of the life spirit. All schools agree with that, though some have odd names for it. And in the Orphic mystery schools of Pythagoras, and especially Plato and the Neoplatonists, the life spirit is called the intellect. So the essence that is brought out of experience and assimilated into the life, into the life spirit is called intellectual soul, because it feeds the intellect. Doesn't mean the mental stuff like what intellect means now. We're going to have a lot more to say about all of this in the next meeting. Now, the name for the essence of chemical experience in the dense physical body is called conscious soul. And that brings up a mystery for me. Is there a somatic residue of conscious soul in the dense physical body, as there is of all the other kinds of souls in the other bodies? Now, if we follow the analogy, if the emotional soul is in the three highest regions of the desire world, and the intellectual soul is found in the two highest regions of the etheric body, then the conscious soul should be found in the highest region of the chemical body, which is gas.
Spinal gas?
What?
Spinal gas?
No, spinal gas is mostly etheric. And the blood is mostly etheric in what is called its gaseous state. I don't know about this. Do you know, have you read anything about this at all? About the location of conscious soul?
I don't remember Steiner saying anything about it. So,
Yeah, nobody talks about this, and these are the questions that come up. They seem, I've discussed this with a lot of other people, and it's kind of strange to think that physical soulfulness would be associated with gassiness. I actually did meet a strange man, 55 years ago in Mexico. And he thought that there was a relationship between farting and spinal gas and spiritual power. He was a strange man. He married this woman and absconded with her two young boys. I think he was a pedophile, and I think he took them down to Mexico where they couldn't get after him. Now, if you think about it, this doesn't disagree with biblical scripture, because the soul is always associated with the breath. And in a lot of languages, breath and soul are the same thing. And that's assuming that the soul is the same thing as the spirit, because the spirit has a flavor according to the experiences that it has gone through. And so that's, that makes sense. Now, I don't know if it has to do with the residual breath. There's some gas that stays in you all the time. And there's gas in solution by pressure in the blood that is not part of the blood itself. And there are gases at various other places in the body. But I don't know if that's what is meant. I find it impossible to conceive of there being a conscious soul, which is the basis of all waking consciousness, that doesn't have a state or a substance in the physical world. Obviously, our self-consciousness has been awakened while we are here in this physical world, and I don't think it's all suddenly taken up into the spirit. So that's something that I don't have an answer for. And that's all the further I want to go for this evening. We have not answered our question, and that'll be the first thing that we answer next time. And that question is, if our bodies are a condensation of what we have learned from the multitude of experiences through our bodies, how are they different from the accumulations of soul in soul growth? And that's a question that's important for understanding the whole process of rethinking and soul assimilation. Any questions?
So with what you talked about with the physical realm, with that experience of the consciousness, so
be involved in the actual evolution of the physical world that you read about. And then Steiner talks about the Atlantean flood and so on, where the air and the liquid
Oh, yes.
separate.
Yes.
Is that part of that?
Yes, I would think that's in the macrocosmic.
Mhm.
But in the human, I think that the soul of the earth, so to speak, is what you're talking about there, and that's perfectly agreeable to me. But in the human, we're going to begin talking about how do you tell a person who's soulful with conscious soul. And we're going to talk about that next time because it's one of the most profound things. That's the thing that, I wanted to say everything all at one time, and it's going to take at least one more and probably 2 or 3 before we get through this, because it's very basic. Right at the bottom of all things is, where do we become conscious? How do we become conscious? And what is consciousness all about? And, how do you tell consciousness? And that's it. Maybe Tinny doesn't want to hear this one.
Timothy, did you ever go into St. Paul's Cathedral? Did you ever go in there?